It's the middle
Oh,
button.
it is. I was
Yeah.
doing the wrong one. Oh, thank you.
It's this one, right?
Yeah, exactly. I kept trying to play with it, but yeah, no, it's I was doing the wrong one. It's this one.
So I think we can start.
Let's do indeed. Oh, good. Thank you.
And the microphones are now working again. You know, they were inadvertently muted.
Oh, that's why.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Well, I mean, excellent now that they're working.
Panel at the end there.
I kept wondering how they could be so bad. Well, that kind of explains it.
And they were turned off.
Okay, let us go ahead and get started. First, a couple of quick announcements. Our deep thanks to all of the undergraduates for all of the seriousness with which you took these first papers. As we noted at the time, we know the absurdity of what we are doing in this class. We know we're asking you to read an insane amount on a weekly basis. Even there, jumping around so dramatically across geography and time span that it's not even a clear set of readings that you can build upon week by week. Our hope, again, is that that juxtaposition will inspire great, powerful thinking. And we know it's equally absurd to ask you to write essays so quickly into the semester wrestling with these incredibly difficult questions. Here, too, we do it for the specific purpose of encouraging you to get into the spirit of this class, which is to wrestle with these incredibly difficult, arguably impossible ideas and really take them seriously. So I say all of this as a preface to thank you for doing so. We know the absurdity of what we're putting you through. We deeply appreciate your seriousness with these papers. We know we are again assigning yet another one coming up very quickly. We very much look forward to reading that one too. I have very little to say about that second one other than please continue with the spirit that all of you brought to that first paper. We loved reading them. We very much look forward to reading the next ones. So thank you all. To the non-undergraduates in the class, hopefully you're getting a sense too of what the sorts of thing we'll be looking for these final projects. We of course will be saying much more about those in a couple of 3 weeks. But here just let me say it will be done with the exact same spirit. That will be true for the undergraduates who will have by then written 2 shorter papers. For the rest of you, this will be your first. Our goal with all of this is simply to encourage you to think big with this material. So thank you all so much both for taking the class and for taking these papers so seriously, and for the undergraduates, the degree to which you are already doing so. So the second announcement is a very happy logistical one. We have all been wondering why those incredibly nice microphones that are put in front of every one of you don't seem to do anything. It turns out it's because they've been muted. So we think from now on the microphones in front of you will work, that when you push them and you get that little green light, actually they will turn on, imagine that. We are ready for the other microphone if it doesn't work. So Steve is happy to run around the room if necessary. However, we might actually have working microphones. So with that as a quick logistical announcement, let us return to the main themes of the class. And let me do so by explaining where we are in terms of the structure of the semester and what we will be doing for the remainder of it. So we, beginning today, will be turning to what we will argue are 2 of the dominant sets of ideas really vying for power in the world today. The one we'll be turning to today will, of course, be that of, we're calling at least, self-fashioning and nonconformity. What it is that means, we as always will be doing a genealogy of it to see where these ideas came from. We have given you some pretty, I suspect you would agree, provocative readings with one vision of what this would mean. And of course, we, beginning today and then continuing next week, will be asking how would we reconstitute this understanding of self-fashioning and nonconformity if we are not completely happy with the form it is thus far taken. And I suspect none of us will be completely happy with that form. Then in 3 weeks, so that will be 2 weeks, and then we have the spring break. When we come back, we will turn to what we would consider to be the other main vision that the world is currently wrestling with, which we are calling that of connection and responsibility. Here, we will, as always, according to this class, be jumping around to bring together the most powerful formulations of these ideas. So in that case, we will be jumping back to this period, midway through the first millennium BCE, where we will be looking at early Confucian texts that we will argue offer the most powerful early philosophical formulation of this ethic. And then in that subsequent week, we will of course turn to what it would mean to reconstitute these ideas in the current world. If we are not completely happy with the current way that that has been done recently, and here too, I suspect we will agree that we are not, what would it mean to rethink these? And then the remainder of the course will be based upon thinking of these two ethics in their reconstituted form together. So what do we do if each of these ethics seems to have some powerful sides? We suspect you will agree that they do, but they will also be at a fundamental level seemingly incompatible. So how do we wrestle with that incompatibility? And if it's not going to be easy to do a simple connection between them, and I think we will agree it's not, what do we do? So that is what we will be doing for the remainder of this semester. And as such, we hope that this huge exercise we've been doing so far will provide us the positions to be able to think through these ideas in their full complexity. So before I continue, any questions about that general structure of where we will be going for the remainder of the course? Good. Well, then let us jump in. So, turning to the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity, let me, as we've done consistently in this course, begin with a very quick genealogy. Some of this, of course, we know well, so I'll be relatively brief since it's a substantial piece of this we've already explored. But just to remind you, this ideology of self-fashioning and nonconformity is, of course, a rereading and secularization of aspects of the Christian tradition. That tradition we have been exploring in a few key ways that will be very relevant to this next side of it that we'll begin to talk about today. As we've discussed, two of the ideas that we find particularly extraordinary in the early Christian teachings are those of love and infinity. Love, meaning again, radical love, impossible levels of love, and infinity, meaning the world is lesser than what could be seen as the divine. The incarnation involves an incarnation of the infinite within a finite form, and what would that mean in terms of a larger ethics? We explored, largely critically, one rereading of that tradition as it has become very, very significant beginning in early modern Europe. That version, as we've discussed, we can put under the general category of liberalism, and one version of that general category is, of course, the academic school philosophy that we began our discussions with. To quickly remind you of that reading, in liberalism, the move essentially is to secularize these ideas from Christianity. However, in that secularization, you have a radical domestication, at least we have argued, of the power of the ideas. So, what do you do about infinity? As we noted, essentially what you do is you say every single individual should normatively be understood as a sovereign, a little god, really little god, and the sovereignty would be exercised over property. So every individual would have property. That property would be their domain, so everyone is a god over their own domain, which is, again, just the property they happen to own. And then the work of liberalism is to say, how do we deal with these sovereign individuals such that we can create a framework in which they can have their property and not kill each other as they attempt to acquire more property? And as we discussed, the mechanisms for this will include things like market economics, where you will create a situation where everyone will have their own property. They can buy and sell in a marketplace. Those who are successful can gain more property. Those who are less successful gain less property. But the sense is it's a marketplace of these sovereign individuals endlessly competing with themselves. The political version, were things like the development of democracy, where all of these sovereigns can join together in interest groups and vote, and through those coalitions, make de facto decisions about what the large-scale policy should be, including about the governance of the marketplace. And this, again, wouldn't be a restriction of your sovereignty, but according to the claim, you would nonetheless be exercising your free sovereignty when you decide which interest group to join and how that would work out. In terms of religious beliefs, the argument was all of your religious beliefs would just be private. So every sovereign individual would be allowed to have their own private religious beliefs. Those would be seen as personal and tolerated as such. And as long as you didn't do anything to impede on the other personal beliefs of other sovereign individuals, that would be seen for the most part as acceptable. So you're allowed to have religion, but it is personal and part of your sovereign property, in a sense. And we also discussed the attempts, particularly by figures like Bentham, to say, okay, along with the marketplace, along with the democracy or democratic frameworks, you also need states that can make larger scale decisions based upon strict utilitarian principles that will, by definition, go beyond any sovereign control, but would be seen as being in the best interests of the most sovereign individuals. So the recent example that we've all experienced during COVID, this wasn't made too public, but we had lots of trickle-down discussions of it. So the US government, of course, had a cost-benefit analysis where they would literally give a monetary amount to a human life. This is true, by the way. And then they would do this cost-benefit analysis of to what degree do we close down parts of the economy, and what economic cost would that be? And then you compare that with the economic cost of how many people you're willing to allow to die, and then you just do a utilitarian calculus of that. That really did happen. They of course, in a democracy, you don't advertise that. Bentham quite correctly realized, these are sorts of things that governments do kind of behind closed doors, but this is how a substantial amount of government policy is based. So you have markets of sovereign individuals competing, you have democratic governances of sovereign individuals forming interest groups to vote in different policies, and then you have a state apparatus that largely operates on utilitarian principles for deciding the state policy the voters are kind of not allowed to vote on and hopefully don't know too much about. That is the framework that you see beginning in theoretical understandings as early as the 17th century, and you start seeing, of course, institutionalized by the 19th century, and we live very much in a world that largely takes much of what I've just mentioned for granted. Now, that is, as we have discussed, a very domesticated version of these extraordinarily powerful ideas emerging out of Christianity. We mentioned relatively in passing another version that today we will be discussing in much more depth in terms of its philosophical elaboration. But we mentioned that beginning in the 19th century, you do also have a reaction against this liberal vision, and that version is what we were calling the Romantic heresy. A Romantic heresy in which you have figures who largely assume the liberal order we just discussed, but see their work as an endless disruption of it. And so the Romantic hero will endlessly try to disrupt the established order. By the 19th century, that established order was largely a liberal order, and they would see their work as endlessly trying to disrupt it. The reason we call this a heresy is because it would, by definition, involve always an individual in endless revolt, but there was no possible way from this way of conceptualizing this to build in anything other than a few elite individuals endlessly trying to disrupt a system until, well, they are kind of forced to stop. And we argued this is an extremely limited version. The reason we discussed it, however, is it absolutely involved a rereading of aspects of the Christian tradition. Here, at least not really building on the love side, and we'll be discussing this in much more depth, but certainly trying to build a much stronger focus on the idea of infinity. Here, of course, the idea being not just that every individual is a little god in the very limited sense of being sovereign over their own property, but the idea being that the great Romantic hero would be in a much more powerful sense divine and divinely battling against a finite world, endlessly battling against a finite world, because that romantic individual was always greater than the finite circumstances in which he, and sadly it was almost always that he during the 19th century, was entrapped. Today, we will be talking about a more philosophical formulation of this idea in two thinkers, Emerson and Nietzsche, two very different thinkers, although, as we'll see, less different than they might have at first glance appeared when you read them, and argue what we perhaps might need to do if we see an element of this as being incredibly powerful and yet dramatically needing a rethinking. So, putting it very straightforwardly, what would it mean to build out these ideas of infinity in a way based upon these notions, but seeing clearly the dangers that have played out in the way this tradition is developed, but also finally taking love much more seriously, an aspect that this tradition has largely ignored, and what would that mean? To do this, we are asking you to read, again, these two figures, Emerson and Nietzsche, and let me begin by saying a few words about them. The power and strength of these figures, they are incredibly exciting figures to read, and also the dangers of them, dangers that I'm sure was evident immediately with Nietzsche, but Nietzsche quite correctly saw himself as very close intellectually to Emerson, and we will want to explore that, to discuss the dangers of these ideas, but also seeing their power, ask how we could accordingly rethink them. So let me now say a few words about these thinkers, digging into them a bit, then pulling out to get to the larger philosophical implications and turning to how we could potentially reconstruct this vision of self-fashioning and nonconformity. So let us begin with Emerson. So Emerson largely assumes the liberal order that we have been discussing. He thinks it is a limiting order, but he largely assumes it because he takes for granted you need some kind of basic democratic order to allow the possibility of figures like Emerson to arise. Now, it is important to note, when he talks about this, it's very much in passing. Emerson, and we will see this if anything more strongly with Nietzsche, says almost nothing about a political order that needs to be created where what he is advocating could more strongly be developed. On the contrary, his view is you need a general democratic world to open up these possibilities, but the rest is up to a few individuals who will do the work to become these extraordinary figures, and that is Emerson's entire concern. What is it that Emerson wants a few individuals to do? Well, his word is very telling. He wants us to become geniuses. And what he means by a genius is an individual who is able to so accurately sense the world that they can, on their own, come up with a truth. That truth would not be a Kantian universalizable law for all sovereign individuals. That truth would be an individual truth that is more than simply a narcissistic vision. It would be an absolute truth that in that situation would be true. I say in that situation because, again, unlike a Kantian vision of sovereign individuals coming up with universalizable laws, for Emerson, this would never be universalizable in a Kantian sense. On the contrary, what it requires is an absolutely radically creative genius who is constantly creating anew on a regular basis. That, for him, is what a genius does. If a genius is held to a law, even one given in a Kantian self-legislating sense, it would be restrictive. A genius is someone who you never know what they're going to say next, but it's going to be stunning and incredible. Emerson very clearly thought he was one of these. And as you have undoubtedly seen in just the limited writings we've given to you, he writes as such. lest you thought, if this was the first time you were reading Emerson, that you were going to have in front of you a very clear, coherent essay where you'd read the introductory paragraph, flip to the conclusion, see what the argument is, and then just quickly glance through the rest of it to see how he gives examples to defend his overall argument, you undoubtedly realized that you were in a completely different world. Emerson intentionally writes, and we didn't just select examples of this at random. I mean, this is a very typical approach in his writings. He surprises you on almost a sentence-by-sentence level. He's writing that way. He is writing to show how exciting he is, how insightful he is. He gets one insightful statement, and bam, he will turn in a completely different direction in the next sentence. So you literally cannot guess what is coming next. And that's part of why reading him is so exciting. It's just like you literally don't know where he's going. Oftentimes you will get lost for that reason. So you're going back saying, whoa, 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 how did I get here? And it's very difficult to reconstruct it because he doesn't give arguments in a fashion of one point leading to the other. He's writing that way intentionally. He is a genius by his own terminology, radically creative, radically insightful. What would these geniuses do, along with writing great works like Emerson does? He wants to be a prophet for other geniuses. He sees his work as opening up the possibilities for great individuals to do what he is doing. He is clearly committed to the idea that we are all capable of doing this, so it is an open-ended vision in that very specific sense. However, he also clearly thinks very, very, very few of us will ever do this. So he sees his work as inspiring those few individuals who will strive to become geniuses, and that is his interest. As I mentioned before, he will say nothing about the others, what political world they will live in, what their ideology should be, and when he talks about the non-geniuses, he doesn't always use the most polite language. He'll talk about the masses, the crowds. He looks down on them. They're the people who aren't the geniuses. And he's focused on the geniuses and those few who could potentially become geniuses. He would then live his life looking for other geniuses. So he was a very close friend of Thoreau, who he absolutely felt to be a genius. He would travel to England and Europe looking for other geniuses, and he loved meeting great geniuses, having these incredible conversations. Sometimes he would admit he was wrong. He thought this one person, this great writer, was a genius, and he'd visit them and say, I had tea with this person, and that he was not a genius, meaning he's not this creative person. You could kind of predict what they were going to say. So he would live his life literally looking for these geniuses. Now, this idea, this Emersonian vision, despite the fact that he was looking very much down upon the crowds and the masses, writing for it in a very, very, very elite few, nonetheless, this vision has become incredibly important in American self-definitions, not undoubtedly by people who have actually read Emerson. He's a great figure to read, but not an easy person to read. Nonetheless, undoubtedly, as you were even reading his lines, you were hitting words and even phrases that have just become common parlance. And so when in America, we in fact are living in very much a liberal order that you can see the beginnings of philosophically developing in the 17th century, Americans like to think that we are great Emersonian individualists. When you read this text, it kind of like reads the way like a lot of Americans like to think of themselves. I am the radical individual. And this terminology, this vision, has just become pervasive in the US. I mention this to say that is really worth pushing aside because the American version of Emerson is not Emerson, and even Emerson's version of Emerson we might not ultimately be very happy with. However, it is a very different thing than the American form of extreme individualism. So to give some obvious examples, when in America we use common terminology like, I am going to live life on my terms, I'm going to look within, find my true self. My true self will then guide my entire life because I will always be true to who I truly am. And by being a true self, I will always be myself and never conform to what is going on in the world around me. I will live my life. All of that sounds great, and it's certainly very, very Emersonian. Note in practice what that actually means for most of us. Number one, the true self often means that we choose what we want to do, meaning we can choose what to I-click on Amazon to buy for our personal property. So it's just basically straightforward liberalism. But note, too, how un-Emersonian that vision really is. Because that vision that I already have some true self already here, I just need to look within, find it, and live my life according to that true self that already exists. Emerson would, and I would strongly defend him on this, hate that idea. Because Emerson would say, well, no, the last thing you want to do is claim yourself to be some true self that you already have within you from some young age, presumably birth, and that you're spending your whole life, to use the American phrase, loving and embracing. Emerson's whole point was, no, it's an endless creative revolution in the self, constantly, endless. And the American version of the individualist version of the true self is nothing like that. From an Emersonian point of view, we are entrapping ourselves, imprisoning ourselves in some predetermined vision of a true self that prevents us from growing, or in his terminology, prevents us from becoming what for him is the ideal, a genius. So despite all of our terminology of thinking we are great Emersonian individualists, Emerson would be horrified at the ways that he has now just become part of, or his ideas have become part of a common self-perception in America of what makes us tick. But if that's the case, let's return to Emerson himself. Note the strengths of this view, which undoubtedly you felt reading it. It's an incredibly exciting read, an incredibly exciting vision, because you get a sense that you're reading someone who kind of is what he says he is. He's obviously, not just obviously intelligent, but a genius in his terms. Like, he is incredibly insightful, forcing you to rethink on literally a sentence-by-sentence level. He is clearly just vitally alive. He gives you that sense when you're reading it of someone who is truly self-fashioning and truly a nonconformist. If that is the power of his thinking, let's say a few words about the potential dangers thereof. Number one, the extreme elitism of Emerson that he never defends but totally takes for granted. Number two, despite the philosophical brilliance of it, note this is still fully following all of the concerns falling into, I should even say, all of the concerns we raised earlier when we were discussing the Romantic heresy. For a genius to be a genius, you have to endlessly, constantly be creative and unpredictable and always saying things that no one could have previously thought or would have even imagined you might have previously thought, because you're already onto a new vision. And you can't even imagine how much time you must have spent crafting essays to give you that portrait, which is another way of saying he, I don't think I'm being mean here, is crafting this vision of a genius, playing the role of being the endless creative individual. He plays it really, really well, which is why we still very happily read him. But to say that he is also entrapping himself in a very different way than our American true self idea, but nonetheless, entrapping himself is, I think, not an exaggeration. He is entrapping himself in this vision of endlessly being the radical creative figure. You also might wonder, what else does he do on a mundane daily basis? So sure, he travels to England and Europe to meet other geniuses, but what does he do when he's eating breakfast and walking through the day? Note how little you find out about that. He certainly doesn't write about it. His friends never talk about it. Thoreau never mentions what he's like on a daily basis. And I think that is for a very simple reason. If you're a self-proclaimed genius, the mundane stuff doesn't really fit into that self-image. So yeah, he probably had the same breakfast every day. That's not something you talk about. What was his domestic life like? Who knows? What, again, at a larger political level, would he have favored, not just for the masses, for whom he really doesn't have any interest, but even for the geniuses? Nothing. He just kind of assumes a world like that in 19th century America that would allow people like him to exist. But what would that actually mean if he didn't happen to be born into a world that allowed a genius like him to exist? I say all of this to make the following point. Emerson not only does not, but in the way he's formulating these ideas, I think arguably could not deal with what it would mean to be this extraordinary, infinite figure, greater than the finite structure that encapsulates and controls and imprisons all the masses. If he's the great, infinite, extraordinarily creative, like a mini god, but not in a lowly sense of someone owning property, but in this extraordinary creative sense, creating his own worlds, if that is your vision, it entraps you in this endless attempt to be radically creative and never have to deal with the question of how do you actually work and create a structure within which infinite beings could exist. What would it mean to create structures in which the structures themselves would be open to constant change by extraordinary figures self-fashioning? What would it mean to make that extraordinary work of self-fashioning less extraordinary so that it would become part of what we would be doing? What would it mean to actually think of extraordinary, infinite, creative creatures who also have to eat breakfast in the morning and have domestic lives? If that is always seen as an opposition to radical creativity, it imprisons you in this world of the endless revolt. In other words, not just what would it mean to take seriously all that Emerson doesn't want to talk about, but how would we even rethink these notions of infinity to make them possible? And getting to that term, which for obvious reasons I have not even mentioned in my discussion of Emerson, what about love? Because if you're going to take love seriously, that of course is about other people and not just restricted to those few other geniuses that Emerson thinks he hopefully will be able to encounter. What would that mean if we do not want to reduce love to simple liberal altruism? What would it mean to incorporate that into a vision of a secularized work of self-fashioning, building upon infinity, but also taking love seriously? Let me use that to make an intentionally awkward segue to our second reading, Nietzsche. Awkward because if Emerson doesn't say a lot about love, well, we're about to turn to someone who not only does not say a lot about love, but would hate the very fact that anyone would be so idiotic as to consider such an issue as being philosophically relevant unless they were anything but one of the masses. Let us now turn to Nietzsche. Now, as I said, this was undoubtedly a surprising juxtaposition, as is true of many of our readings when you jump from Emerson to Nietzsche. However, this is a rare moment when our surprising juxtapositions in our readings are, at least in terms of the thinking of the individuals, less surprising than you might think. So Nietzsche read Emerson, doesn't talk about him much, and there are literally 2 references that Nietzsche makes to Emerson. However, Nietzsche sees in Emerson a kindred soul to himself. He absolutely thinks that Emerson was a genius, and he absolutely thinks that what he is trying to cultivate, he'll use a different word, but is something very similar to an Emersonian genius. So he sees himself as very close to Emerson. And unlike Emerson, however, Nietzsche, is going to give an entire genealogy as to why figures like him, geniuses, but he's going to use a very different word to describe this, why they are now becoming possible, and how that entire vision emerged. It will also be based upon a genealogy from Christianity, but as you have seen in your readings, it's a slightly different genealogy than the ones that we have been giving you so far in this course. So let me now say a few words about Nietzsche. And let me begin with his term for what Emerson was calling genius. The term that Nietzsche will give for what he wants to cultivate to being, I think it's safe to say he thought he was already one, but he thought there needed to be more coming as well. His term is, and I'll first use the German just because it does not translate well into English, Übermensch, which literally means the overman, which again translates weirdly, but that's literally what it means, someone who is transcending lowly humanity. It's sometimes translated the Superman, which of course sounds like the American superheroes. That's even more bizarre as a translation. But think of it as the figure who transcends the mass of normal humanity. Unlike Emerson, who, as we said, will say relatively little about the masses other than looking down on them, but it says very little about them, Nietzsche, on the contrary, has a whole theory about the masses and why world history has developed, at least in the West as it has, and why now, finally, in his opinion, you have the moment of the dawning of figures like himself, and he saw Emerson as another one, the Übermensch, finally coming into play. So very quickly, Nietzsche's genealogy of how we got to where we are, he's exclusively looking at the Western tradition, of course, is the following. In pre-Christian worlds, the pagan worlds before Christianity, there were great heroic individuals who were not embarrassed at their great nobility. So, Homer would write about these great figures like Achilles, in that case a warrior figure, on his chariots with his Bronze Age weapons, battling against his opponents, living up to a noble ideal, looking down, of course, on the masses, who at best would run beside him to hand him his Bronze Age weapons and swords as he's riding his chariots, but he was unabashedly a great noble figure. This same idea, Nietzsche argues, was true in Rome as well, where you have these great noble aristocrats who would lead armies and make great decisions in the Senate, not to help those around them, but precisely because they were great nobles. And why did this world, sadly for Nietzsche, fall apart? Because the masses, those who were not the nobles, watched these great noble figures, knew they could never live up to that level of nobility, and therefore developed this incredible resentment against the great nobles. That resentment developed into the religion of, yes, Christianity. So Nietzsche will read Christianity as a religion of resentment. It is a religion in which you say noble ideals should be stopped. This is part of a pagan world. They should be stopped. And we, the slaves, should rise up, and we now we will have this herd mentality, which will now be the accepted wisdom. So no one should ever become a noble. We should rather all be in the herd, or rather I should put it much more strongly, as Nietzsche always does, that the herd is the proper world, and these nobles are simply putting us down. This vision, according to Nietzsche, was horrible. It is a religion of the resentful herd as against the nobles. Western history then plays out as such until finally, and this will sound like a bad thing, but for Nietzsche it is wonderful, until finally in his day, or beginning a little bit earlier, so over the course of the 19th century, God is seen as dying. This is good because God, as understood in Christianity, according to Nietzsche's genealogy, is that figure who supports this herd mentality, and once God is dead, it means the possibility of overthrowing it. But now you're not just overthrowing Christianity, because in that herd mentality that has been developing also develops all of the major political ideologies of the 19th century, now in secularized form, but he thinks it's simply a continuation of the herd mentality of Christianity. In this, he would include liberalism, socialism, all of these isms, secular to be sure, but a secularization of a Christian herd mentality that's all about trying to create an equitable world for everyone, meaning keeping down the nobles. And what now would be possible, now that God is dead, And now that these secular ideologies are reigning, but without God, maybe there's a possibility for a new nobility to arise. This is what he saw his work as ushering in. Now, for him, the new nobility should not be Homeric warriors on chariots. He's thinking not of a warrior elite. He wants it to be a philosophical elite. A philosophical elite that will see the dangers of the way Christianity developed, but build on certain aspects of it. Because, well, Homer was just Homer. And the description of Achilles was just, well, Achilles. But a true philosopher would be a transcendent being who would be the equivalent of the Christian God, but not in supporting a herd morality, but rather by being this extraordinary transcendent figure who could question all of the values of the herd mentality and create new values for the world, just as the Christian God did, although the Christian God, of course, according to him, was simply creating values for a herd mentality. The new Übermensch will create new values, overthrowing all of this, but the values for the elite Übermensch of the world. Just as Emerson thought he was a genius, and just as Nietzsche thought Emerson indeed was, Nietzsche also thought clearly he was an Übermensch. He was the philosopher giving us the new values. He, by his own reckoning, therefore, is this infinite divine force, stuck, of course, in a finite world, but unhappily, and therefore he is going to break apart this finite world with his powerful, infinite, transcendent ideas. What will be the future of the world once the Übermensch, like himself, are unleashed upon it? We cannot predict, which is precisely what is so, for Nietzsche, exciting. The Übermensch will finally lead the future. What will the rest of us do? Well, we will follow them because we're not Übermensch. They, the Übermensch, will create the values in which we will live. Hopefully for us, they'll be good values, but regardless, they now have learned the lesson of the past, and they will no longer allow themselves to be restricted by a herd mentality. They will know that the masses are masses, they will be controlled by the Übermensch, and they will be kept in their place. Then there will never be a return to something like Christianity. What, you are undoubtedly asking, in the world would this look like in terms of a political practice? Well, he says literally nothing about what it would look like, in part, I think, just to be honest to his own philosophy. If he laid out a political view, the idea would be that would somehow be restrictive of future Übermensches, because he'd have to follow the one view, and so he's not going to lay out what exactly this would look like. However, it is always, with these philosophies, as we have seen, interesting to see how later people will read them. Not, as we've also seen consistently, because those readings are always right. They're never right. They're picking up certain elements, but it's often telling, however, what people will pick up. And so let me give you a few of these later readings. I don't mean to imply any of these are accurate readings, but it's telling they're going to be inspired by a Nietzsche. They certainly would not be inspired by, well, in the examples I'm going to be giving, a Rousseau. So, one of the most famous figures who loved Nietzsche was Hitler. Now, again, before I get into this, I will again underline, I'm not claiming Hitler was an accurate reader of Nietzsche, but he was a lover of Nietzsche. We actually have, chillingly enough, Hitler's library, and Nietzsche books he read them, underlined things, wrote comments on them all over. He loved Nietzsche. Now, it was a selective reading. Obviously, he loved the discussions of the triumph of the will of the Übermensch. Hitler clearly saw himself as an Übermensch. You won't be surprised he did not underline the places where Nietzsche very strongly criticizes German nationalism, for example. So, needless to say, it's a very selective reading. However, those pieces that he loved, the great Übermensch, giving new values to the world, happy to destroy socialism and liberalism and creating this new world of radical life and vitality for the few who follow him and total destruction for the poor fools who won't follow him. I mean, Nietzsche is, telling Freudian slip, Hitler is not inaccurately seeing that vision, if not the content of it, in Nietzsche. What is another example of Nietzsche? Well, intriguingly, along with Emerson, Americans love Nietzsche. I can't imagine too many have actually read him, but in the domesticated version, kind of like you get the domesticated version of Emerson, it's read in America, or again, I think it's literally read, it's understood in terms of the Nietzsche that's kind of come down to people as simply American forms of individualism, that Nietzsche is talking about us all as being great individuals, calling on us to be great individuals, giving value to our own lives. So just as you have the kind of true self rereading of Emerson, you have kind of the radical individualist rereading of Nietzsche, and Americans love to see themselves as living out these ideas. Here too, that is a really, really, really domesticated reading of Nietzsche, and to deal with the power and danger of a Nietzsche, it's worth wrestling with him himself. So let me now say a few more words. The power of Nietzsche, I would put it slightly differently than Emerson, who's just endlessly fascinating to see what he'll say on the next line. Nietzsche is obviously, there's a terror and a chilling quality when you read Nietzsche that he's very intentionally trying to give us to shake us in his vision out of our herd mentality. But there's also no question he's an incredible writer, unbelievably brilliant, incredibly powerful. Even when you're reading things that you're just horrifying, there's this incredible just excitement of this figure who just wants us to embrace life, embrace vitality, throw away all of the norms that hold us back. It is this incredibly powerful reading. In that sense, for all the other differences, like Emerson, you just get this incredible inspiration for a vision of life and vitality, not being held back by norms, structures that restrict what we could do. The dangers, of course, are a version of what we saw with Emerson. What in the world would this mean to actually build an institutional order like this? And I would be much more cautious even than with Emerson, because again, I don't want to say Hitler was an accurate reader of Nietzsche, but it is difficult to imagine a real reading of Nietzsche that would not involve something like that, of some figure given unbelievable amounts of power because he sees himself, and more importantly is seen by others as being an Übermensch. The values that person wants to give to the world, everyone thinks they must simply follow because this is the equivalent of a deity, but here alive with us right now on the planet. And it is difficult to imagine this could be not only an Emersonian world of extreme elitism, but an incomparably more dangerous world where those elites would be given absolute political power. A world where, again, even if it's not someone as horrific and evil as a Hitler, nonetheless, even someone less horrific, this is a very, very, very dangerous vision if it were ever to be put into political practice. So let me take that point to now move to the next stage of our discussion. If there is something, and I suspect we all agree that there is, incredibly powerful about this reading of the Christian tradition, yes, secularizing it, but trying to absolutely take infinity seriously, this notion that the divine is greater than the limited world around us, that infinity is by definition greater than the finite. And if we are to think of humans as in some ways like the incarnation, there is more in us, greater infinity in us than there is in the finite surroundings that otherwise would restrict us. If there's something to this in terms of the power it would give in terms of a vision of the possible focus on life, vitality, nonconformity, if that is an exciting vision, and if that is, albeit in its a very domesticated form, what has so excited people for so long when they read these texts, what would it mean to, number one, avoid those domesticated versions? In other words, the current version that's become dominant in America, that is obviously not living up to these ideals in any significant degree. But what would it also mean to finally do what Emerson would not do, and what Nietzsche openly hated the thought of doing, which was to also take seriously love? Could we take a vision of radical self-fashioning and radical nonconformity, focusing on the infinite, and could we, number one, allow that to be brought into a vision about not just what we would do in our radical acts of rebellion against the world around us, but what we would be doing on a daily basis at a very mundane level, to bring it into a political understanding where we would actually be trying to create an institutional order that would not, as with Emerson, just sort of assume a democracy without having to worry about it, or with Nietzsche, overtly hating democracy, but would actually create a world that would be, yes, structures, but structures that would be infinitely pliable by figures who are seeing themselves as actively trying to rethink the world constantly, and yet not doing so in the kind of radical individualism, or claimed radical individualism, that has taken hold in the American reading of this, but would actually see self-fashioning and nonconformity as not in contradiction with love and a strong support for the self-fashioning and nonconformity of those other infinite beings, humans, around us. What would it mean, in other words, to take the power of these ideas, to take seriously the incredible dangers that we have seen in Emerson, and I would say much more so, needless to say, in Nietzsche, and rework what this would mean? Not falling back into the domesticated form of liberalism, really taking seriously infinity, in other words, but building in love and thinking, what would that mean institutionally? What would that mean in terms of a domestic mundane life? What would that mean if you took these ideas seriously and reworked their ideas to make them doable? This is what we will be wrestling with immediately for these 2 weeks. You might think that's a kind of a tall order to wrestle with completely. It is, but don't worry, because then when those subsequent 2 weeks, we turn to the whole counter vision of coordination and connection. We will then come back to this with these two, by then hopefully reconstituted readings, and begin pushing them against each other, hoping by that, but not simple resolution, but by sort of pushing them against each other, each will be allowed, we hope, to be refined yet further, and the powers and potential dangers of each will become all the more highlighted. So with that as a basic introduction to these ideas, let me now turn things to, let's open up to
class,
questions.
but I did want to emphasize one aspect of your presentation, which I think deserves discussion. Anyone hearing your presentation would wonder about the relation between the extraordinary and the ordinary.
Yes.
That is, so first, the infinite.
Yes.
The infinite translated to an ordinary life in an ordinary world.
Yes.
What does it mean?
Yes.
What is its political expression?
Yes.
And what is its moral expression?
Yes.
And the second thing is, you say the danger is to separate the theme of the infinite from the theme of love. That's where there's the greatest discrepancy between these thinkers as you present them in Christianity.
Yes. Yes.
That the infinite without love is a kind of heroic perversion.
Right.
The infinite with love is something else, but what is it?
What is it?
Because,
Exactly.
Because the obvious objection is love depends on intimacy.
Absolutely.
What does it mean outside the sphere of intimacy?
Yes.
So that these ideas
Yes.
being mobilizing, inspiring in one sense,
Yes.
are perplexing in another,
Yes.
and they seem to signal some kind of perversion
Yes.
unless we provide them with a different set of implications.
Yes.
Well, let's.
Yeah, well, let me give, I won't answer, but let me give a couple of very quick statements and open this up. And I'll begin with the second if it's okay, and then the first. So in terms of the second, absolutely. And you see with Emerson and Nietzsche, and I would generalize this for great thinkers out of this tradition, there is, ironically, a armor that's built around these geniuses and Übermensches. They would deny that, of course, because they say, no, I'm endlessly creative, but it is an armor in the sense that, by definition, they are not vulnerable, they are extraordinary, they are amazing, and the fact that, yes, they eat breakfast and they are very vulnerable when they're, no one's seeing them behind closed doors, is something, by definition, they cannot talk about. If we take love seriously, to build on the point Roberto made 3 weeks ago, love means we are vulnerable by definition. And should we see this as a contradiction to the infinite? Absolutely not. I don't mean to imply that that's going to be easy to bring together, but if we are going to take self-fashioning and nonconformity seriously, self-fashioning and nonconformity means we are going to be not just willing ourselves to be vulnerable to those around us, that vulnerability would be an inherent part of self-fashioning. Instead of building up this armor that I am the invulnerable Übermensch, I'm beyond the mundane. No, it's precisely in the mundane, in our relationships, in the vulnerability of that we can potentially do the work of self-fashioning. And just, again, going very quickly, but touching on the first point, politically too. One of the basic reasons there doesn't seem to be any possible way of building an acceptable politics out of Nietzsche, well, and a politics out of Emerson or an acceptable politics out of Nietzsche, is directly related because, again, you're always committed to these elite, few, extraordinary figures. If we take the mundane and take vulnerability seriously in our interrelationships, what does that mean to actually develop institutional orders that would be endlessly changeable by our work, but they would be institutional orders, meaning that they would be based upon our relationships. And instead of giving us the invulnerable great figures who can't be touched by the masses who have to live in the world of institutions, what would it mean actually to see self-fashioning and nonconformity as being an inherent part of the work you're doing on a regular basis? And therefore the nonconformity isn't rejecting the masses, the nonconformity is a refusal to allow existing structures to control us, but not because you are endlessly in revolt against them, it's because you are building in the possibility of endlessly changing them and endlessly working on them. So I agree, to take these ideas seriously, to, as you said, bring infinity and love together means we have to dramatically rethink the whole Emersonian, Nietzschean, and the entire romantic reading of this tradition and try to rethink what that would mean. So yeah, let us throw this out, yes. And again, we think the microphones will work now, so let's try the microphones. If they don't, Steve is ready to run as usual with the other microphone. So let's throw this out. Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
It works.
I have a little bit dumb question, but I think it's basic. The question is, why don't we just living like an animal? Let me try to phrase this question more intellectually, because it's on the contrary of what Emerson and Nietzsche just said. This line of thinking has actually been defended, or rather practiced, by cynics. I mean the ancient Greek cynics, like Diogenes of Sinope. And in addition to the cynics, Taoists, especially Zhuangzi, would also have similar ideas, just living like an animal. Of course, this view can easily refuted in religious traditions. For example, in Christianity, humans are created in God's image. In Buddhism, humans are more likely to attain enlightenment in this world. Even Confucianism reminds us that the difference between humans and animals is small, and we should be careful not turning into animals. But if we discard these metaphysical assumptions, what reason do we have to oppose this view? Moreover, especially considering the upcoming era of AI, we could easily choose to live like animals, more like livestock or pets, right? Like wild dogs go out and hunt and something. We just let AI and robots fulfill our needs and desires, then we can live a lovely, happy, painless, and more important, peaceful life. imagine Hitler just living a life like a sheep, just chewing his grass or something. In this sense, why should we just strive to become a overman or pursue any kind of like self-improvement to like avoid any chaos might come in the way? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, it is a great question. And let me just underline its significance by saying there's a pretty good argument to make that this is exactly where we're going. so it is worth putting on the table for discussion.
Michael, could you,
Yes.
for the benefit of everyone, could you reformulate?
Oh,
could you restate his question?
Absolutely.
all
So
know
the
what
microphones
you're saying?
kind of work, but not fully. So let me restate. We may also, Steve, still ask you to run back and forth. But let me quickly restate the question. The question was, all of the thinkers we've gone through so far, albeit in different ways, but this would also include the Confucian thinkers that we'll get to in a few weeks, all of them are basically humanists in some larger sense of the term, right? All of them are committed to the idea that we humans should build a human world and make it better. So in the ideas we've been tracing from Christianity, the idea is we humans can make a better world by seeing us in liberalism as all sovereign little gods. In this stronger vision of self-fashioning we've been discussing today, you want to radically enhance the human precisely by seeing the human, by enhancing the powers of the human, by making it more divine and vice versa, so divinity becomes part of the human. As you correctly noted, Buddhism too, although literally anti-humanist in the most obvious sense, but as the questioner correctly pointed out, nonetheless in Buddhism, still it's humans who are seen as the ones most likely to be able to do the self-cultivation required to achieve this level of radical compassion. So animals are taken very seriously in Buddhism. They are living creatures. We should not kill them. But definitely there is, and I think this is absolutely true, an emphasis given on the humans as being the stage in a reincarnation cycle where you are more able to develop this universal compassion. And going quickly, because we'll be discussing in much more detail in 3 weeks, but certainly in the Confucian view, we will see absolutely the view is we humans who initially in distant antiquity lived like animals, and the Confucian view is we, and correctly from this point of view, developed constructed, invented, created a human world in which we could thrive. So, albeit in very different ways, all of these traditions are humanist in very, very different definitions of what human would mean, but I think the point definitely holds. And the questioner also mentioned in passing.
But what was the point about animals?
Oh, so but the question was, why then isn't it perfectly fine for us, on the contrary, instead of focusing on how humans could live a more enhanced life, why not just become animals? And AI now makes this a very realistic possibility. Imagine a world, and it's not tough to imagine, where the machines would just organize the world for us. We could be perfectly happy animals, like a happy cat being patted all the time by a human, but we'd be the equivalent. So we would just be, lying on the bed being patted by our AI, who would then feed us things, and the AI would organize the world. We would cease striving. It might end all wars. It might end all political conflicts, and we would just, be happily sleeping.
But focus on that. So on the question of why should we not live like animals?
Yes.
One answer is that we suppose, I don't know whether correctly, according to the zoologist or ethologist, but we suppose that animals don't know that they're going to die. And animals have no conception, no experience of time. So, and we think that our knowledge of our impending death is in many different ways vital to how we should live.
Yes.
And to our understanding, our limited understanding of our situation,
Yes.
such as we can have it. On the other hand, why should we not live as a machine, AI?
Absolutely.
And the answer is, the machine acts according to a formula or an algorithm that we imprint in it. And we are the beings who are capable of breaking the formula or the algorithm, rather than acting according to one. And so that's why we don't want to live as if we were AI. And that's also why answering previously, we want to live like we're animals. And that then leads to the infinite. So the infinite is the negation of living like a machine or living like an animal, is it not?
I fully agree. However, I think the questioner is right to say a lot of humans seem perfectly happy with living like an animal from this conception or like AI. And so the question, and again, it comes back to the cognitive gap, it's what's wrong with that? And part of the argument I would give, and part of the power of these prophecies we've been discussing, is they are calling on us to break from that world. And I find it extraordinarily powerful, but I can't deny a lot of humans they would never phrase it philosophically like I'm about to say it, but in their daily life would accept the idea that, yeah, if I could have AI that would allow me to be the equivalent of the cat being patted all the time, great.
So one way of making this discourse of Nietzsche and Emerson more prosaic and bringing it down to reality is it's saying, don't live like an animal.
Yes,
and don't live like AI.
Absolutely.
In order to be human.
Exactly.
And so, but this is sort of godlike, right?
Absolutely.
And so you can't be human unless you try to become godlike.
Yes.
Is the formula.
Yes.
And that makes the discourse that they present less objectionable than it otherwise would be.
Yeah, but let me also sit for a moment on the objectionable part is a weirdly enough good thing. And what I mean by that is all three of these that we have discussed so far, so the visions of love and infinity developed in Christianity, the visions of the no-self developed in Buddhism, the visions of humanism that we'll be seeing developed out of Confucianism, all of them, albeit with very different terminology, would actually get to this question. And they would all say, but they'll give it for different reasons, but they would all say, our danger as humans is, in a sense, one of our normal states is largely to accept the world into which we are born, simply seek to make it as pleasant for ourselves before we die as we possibly can, and really not question it to any significant degree. That all three would say, this is how, sadly, most of us live our lives, and all three would see their work as trying to wake us up, and to try to say we are capable of doing something incomparably more extraordinary. Even, and I think all three would say, even if that includes all of the dangers of the objectionable sides, even if it, going back to your example, includes the not only possibility, but sadly likelihood of incredible levels of strife, incredible even wars developing, but yet all would say it is better to open up that world of potentiality rather than allowing us to do what sadly many of us will tend to do, which is simply to accept the world as it already is. Now, whether that's really fair to say that's what animals do is another question, but I think going back to the question, that would be the concern for all three of these, that's our danger. Getting back to the question of why is this better? I mean, in a sense, that's sort of underlying the whole focus of this class. We are convinced that the prophets are right. We are convinced that the prophets are right, that we as humans should not allow this. We certainly think human history proves we are capable of much more. We certainly think human history proves we have not come up with a final vision, to put it mildly, but that effort to develop something extraordinary in our lives and build extraordinary worlds, look at the ways, the radically different sorts of worlds we have been able to build, and imagine what that could mean going forward were we to take these ideas seriously, yet again, in albeit radically reconstituted forms. But I agree. I think the danger is we have a tendency to simply say, the world is fine, as they would say in Buddhism. I'll just create a little world where I will be as happy as I possibly can be and just not see the horrible world around me. I think that is our danger as humans. All three of these philosophies would agree with that. Yes, please.
Okay. I was wondering.
Yeah. Some of the microphones work better than the others. That one works pretty well.
Pretty loud, yeah. This conversation kind of made me wonder whether you can consider infinity with structures, like if that's even a worthwhile endeavor, or if they're fundamentally incompatible with one another. particularly because a lot of these romantic thinkers we're talking about, there's this endless state of rebellion and like deconstruction. And so it seems like if all of your needs are met, in this case where we are like animals, I guess, if there's no suffering, no struggle, are you then able to conceptualize infinity, or does like having sort of a stable life somehow diminish it?
Yes.
And at the same time, I was really intrigued by the fact that you said that a lot of these thinkers don't talk about the mundane and the ordinary, and they also don't talk about love. So does that imply that love is an ordinary thing? Does love necessitate some sort of, mundane aspects, which would imply institutions and structures? How do you take it seriously without domesticating it and making it a simple act of altruism?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Wonderful question. And let me begin with the very end of it and then get to the heart of it. So, in the ways we normally conceptualize these issues, the answer is a strong yes. So let me begin with domestic life. As Roberto mentioned a few weeks ago, note in the great romantic novels about the great hero questing for breaking from conformity and then either dying tragically at the end or finding amazing love, but then the novel ends. Either way, what you don't get is volume 2 of the mundane married life of, of the person both alive and living a daily mundane life. Precisely because, as you said, that vision of the infinite, of the radical individual, is seen as inherently in contradiction to structures of any kind, most certainly including the mundane structures of just daily life, which gets us to the heart of your question. Could we rethink our notion of structure? And I would say absolutely. So our notion of structure largely comes from these Greek definitions of a structured cosmos in which there are timeless structures that are what really matter in the world. The more recent version of those there are natural laws that govern the world. In terms of our mundane reality, there are fundamental structures in the world, and therefore, if we are to take infinity seriously, it would by definition be at radical odds with the structured world of being. And hence, in early Christianity, as we were discussing, you get this incredible vision of infinity that then is the theologians attempt to work into a Greek vision of structure, a Greek definition of being, creating all of these tensions that we have been discussing, which very much continues to the present date with exactly the issues you were mentioning and plays out with figures like Emerson and Nietzsche in the version of the world around us is structure. I, the great Übermensch, or the genius for Emerson, am always breaking radically against this, but it has to be an endless breaking against it because as soon as you're down in this world, living in the world of structure, including just mundane daily life, by definition, you're no longer infinite, you're no longer extraordinary. Now, does this seem like an impossible problem to solve? Only because we so accept the Greek definition of being. So, is that definition of being correct? I would say absolutely no. To again give a hint of where what we'll be discussing in more detail in 3 weeks, in classical China, I was about to say there's no such vision. That's actually putting it tellingly incorrectly. There was a vision, and it was absolutely opposed. So the view that will develop in classical China is everything should be thought of in terms of interactions and relationships. Everything. The entire world that would be described in contemporary Western science, dating back to Greek definitions of being, is there are natural laws that, for example, govern the change of the seasons. Just to give you an example, in classical China, that would be discussed as the energies that we humans can categorize in terms of things like yin and yang. They are different types of energies. They are endlessly in interaction. Those interactions can form patterns. Those patterns will in general replicate themselves, but they are absolutely changeable because everything is based upon these interactions. We humans absolutely can change those, what we would call structures, but here they would not be structures, they're simply larger patterns. We humans fall into patterns. Many of them, as we'll see in detail, turn out not to be very good patterns, but they're absolutely changeable because they're not structures of being, they are simply patterns of interaction that can harden, but hardening is usually seen as a dangerous thing. You don't want hardened structures. You want things to be ever-changing. You know, the basis of Chinese medicine. It's like, why does my arm hurt? It's because there's a lack of a movement and flow of the energy. It's gotten stuck. It's gotten hardened. So the whole push is about breaking down structures, but not breaking them down by a radical revolution against them all the time, but in, again, a very mundane sense of how do you actually form better connections and better relationships based upon more refined ways of working together? That is a radically different definition of structure. I'm not even sure structure is the word we'd even want to use for it. And
But the question presented that our colleague there presents is, what is the worldly counterpart to these
Precisely.
otherworldly ideas, right?
Precisely.
So let's take two aspects of it. So one is the idea of the infinite in society, and there you can say, imagine that there are two categories of moves that we make. We make ordinary moves within a framework of assumptions and arrangements that we take for granted, prosaic, ordinary life.
Yes.
And then there are extraordinary moves by which from time to time, typically under the provocation of crisis, we challenge and change pieces of the framework. So we progress, we advance morally and practically by narrowing the distance between these two categories of moves, so that the extraordinary moves by which we challenge and change pieces of the framework arise more naturally and continuously out of the ordinary business of life, the ordinary moves. And through that process conducted iteratively, we're able over time to create institutions that facilitate their own revision all the time without needing crisis to be the provocation. And that's a this-worldly interpretation of the romantic idea of the infinite with respect to politics. Now, then there's the other question, the other side of it, which you bring up with your reference to love. So we think love can't really flourish in relations among strangers. It depends on intimacy. And this is related to the undiscussed problem in modern social thought of coldness. So the two great themes of social theory are subjugation and disunion. Disunion is a theme of the conservative tradition in sociology and social theory like Durkheim, and subjugation is the theme of the left, like Marx. But there's a third theme, the theme of coldness. So in these societies, as I think we discussed the other day, it's the middle distance. It's Schopenhauer's porcupines. It's Madame de Staël who said, these are societies that are prolific in meetings that rob us of solitude without affording us company. Where does the heat come from in these societies? The heat that we would expect from love and we can't have among strangers. And I think a possible answer is the heat comes from the imagination. It doesn't come from the diffusion of the affect of the family in the larger life of society. That's the idea that the Chinese are historically attracted to. If you want there to be heat in society, then the relation between men and women, between emperors and subjects, between bosses and underlings, has to have something of the affect of the family, right? And that leads you to this idea, characteristic of most societies in the past, that each social relation will have an element of exchange, an element of power, and an element of affect. There'll be the sentimentalization of unequal exchange will be the basic formula of social life. That's incompatible with freedom, with emancipation, and therefore with the infinite. So what's the alternative to that? The alternative to that is creating institutions that are, as it were, the tangible instruments of the imagination. Because their object, like a high-energy democracy or a knowledge economy for the many, is the perpetual creation of the new. And so then we would say, the heat will not come from love. The heat will come from imagination. And imagination has an affinity to love. So that's another attempt. So these are all attempts, the first one and the second one, to bring this romantic idea closer to the world, to make it this worldly. And that's the route on which we are embarked, I think. Now, that's what many are trying to do in the world right now.
And just to underline the point, I mean, exactly as Roberto said, as long as we are stuck with this vision of unchanging structures, with, again, the extraordinary always being in direct opposition to, to that structure, it again means the endless romantic revolt, or as Roberto said politically, the moment of crisis when finally things can be changed before they're put back into a structure. But what would it mean if we did not operate with such a vision of structure? That actually our vision, on the contrary, was one in which our mundane world.
So the romantic idea with
is
respect to
changeable.
structure, the romantic idea with respect to structure is structure kills spirit.
Yes.
So, and the moments in which we're truly human are those interludes in which we shake the structures. It's the crowd in the streets. It's the cultural revolution, rather than the bureaucratic despotism, right? Or it's romantic love as opposed to the routines of married life that can't be represented in the romantic novel. And so the romantic thinks we can be human only negatively in these interludes in which we shake the structures. But what we can't do is to change the relation between structure and spirit, and to create structures that are permanently more hospitable to the spirit. So romanticism is a form of despair about our power to change the relation between spirit and structure.
Yes.
And that's the first theme that we were discussing before.
Precisely.
And the second theme then is the alternative source of the heat that will come to rescue us from the coldness of the contemporary societies. And it's not going to be like just love among intimates. It's going to be this other power of the imagination. And that's the antithesis to AI. AI won't love us.
Yes, please.
Question is kind of building off of this discussion, which is it necessary to incite individual spiritual revolutions within a society to change ideas of what is pliable and what is unchangeable in terms of structures, or is this something that can be done from top down, so starting at reconstructing systems and structures and creating new institutions? So is it inherently necessary to start at the level of the ideological in the communal and individual, and how would this be done?
Yes. So this microphone isn't quite as good, so let me quickly repeat it, but feel free to correct my repetition because I couldn't quite get all of it. So the question was, is the work we're talking about something that requires it to be done at the level of ideas with implicitly a top-down vision, or are there other approaches? Was that my sort of getting it? Please correct me.
Yeah, no, that was it. I was thinking about, I don't know if you know Simone Weil, but she has this idea of like individual spiritual revolutions being necessary for structural change. And so I was just wondering if we could discuss that a little bit in terms of structures versus individual change being the locus point for revolution of structures and systems.
Yes. So let me say an initial response, and I would love to hear Roberto's view of this too. As an initial response, I would say it is certainly true in the discussions that we've had certainly today with an Emerson and a Nietzsche. They would say these are ideas that could only come from those elite few, the geniuses and the Übermensch, who will then, well, at best give them to the masses, although the masses won't really hear. So give them to the masses in the sense of saying the masses for the Übermensch model must simply follow the Übermensch. Is it possible that we could think of ideas in a different way? And I would say absolutely yes. The reason we have focused on ideas in this course is to say if, and all three of these would put this in different ways, but if one of our dangers as humans is a tendency to accept the world we're born into as natural, the customs we were born into is simply the way the world is organized, and we're very good at training ourselves to simply make the best of our lives in the worlds and in the context within which we're born. If that is one of our dangers as humans, the question for all of these movements is, how do you wake people up? And it is absolutely true, they will try to give you visions for what that would mean, but those visions also are, in all of these cases, absolutely based upon practices too. They're all based upon practices that we would be putting into place literally on a daily basis, and that's certainly true even with this philosophy, albeit in a reconstructed form. What would it mean in these daily practices to change all of that? And therefore, getting back to the heart of your question, I would say that would only work if this is something that is being done, well, by as many people as humanly possible. And in terms of how you get there, one of the reasons we are teaching this crazy class that we're very happy you all are willing to be involved in is education is absolutely a clear place where this could now be done in a contemporary society. We sadly don't do this in America very much, and yet there's no reason we can't. And if imagine a system, and as Roberto said, this really would need to happen well before just college, but imagine a K through 12 that would actually be training students, not just by having them read reconstructed versions of Nietzsche, which would be a scary thought, but actually developing the practices of reading, rethinking the world.
Vision and imagination.
Yes, a vision and
Yeah,
imagination.
so-
That is absolutely doable. We don't do it, but it is absolutely doable, in which case we will be doing exactly what we're saying. We will be doing the equivalent of what Simone Weil was doing, but we will be educating entire generations to be doing this.
So
Yes.
Schopenhauer makes this remark in The World as Will and Representation. What's the difference between a talented person and a genius? We're talking about geniuses now. And he says, the talented man is like a marksman who hits a target that others cannot hit. The genius is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot see. So genius is not a form of, it's not about power. It's not like a super intelligence. The academy is full of people who think that because they're very good at taking tests, ought to be considered geniuses. And that's the main form of academic ressentiment, right?
Yes.
So given this nature of genius, that genius is vision, the question is, can visionary powers, prophetic powers, be widely diffused in the whole of humanity? In the Protestant Reformation, the central theme was, there are no priestly intermediaries between the believer and God. And here the question is, no prophetic intermediaries. Everyone can be a prophet.
Yes.
Is a central theme of democracy.
Yes.
And can these prophetic powers of vision be cultivated deliberately by a specific form of education?
Yes.
That's also a great project. And that's what one other counterpart, this worldly counterpart to the question of the infinite.
Yes. Yes, and let me just give another example, again, as we keep jumping around, and this is jumping forward a bit, but another example of this with a very different terminology and yet building on something very similar in terms of its goal. A Confucian thinker, his name is Xunzi, he's critiquing his education in his own day, but it's a very effective critique of American education today as well. He has an argument that we falsely assume that everyone is born with certain gifts that they are by definition really good at, and other things that by definition they're not good at. And the goal of education is first to track what people are good at, and then really help them in the things they're good at, and not have them waste time in the things they're not good at. So the equivalent of the geniuses would be the ones who are really gifted at something, and you try to track them in that, and the ones who aren't gifted at anything, you just put into not very good classes. And Xunzi's view is, this in practice is the way we actually educate people. Now, of course, had he been born in today's America, he would see this is totally institutionalized. So anyone who grew up in America, you were tested on a constant basis. Everything you did was tracked. You were put into different courses based upon what you were tested at being good at age 6. That's insane. And then it's self-reinforcing because, of course, if you're put in really good classes because you're tested as being good at math, well, of course, you're going to get better at math because it's what your focus is because you're being put in the good classes. And if you're not tested as being good at English, you won't get very good at it because you're being de facto told you're not very good at it, so take these bad classes that where the teachers don't care. And so as Shunsa correctly notes, create a system like that, even in his day when it wasn't as institutionalized. What you create is a world where you're not educating people to actually rethink the world around them. You're just training them de facto to continue doing something that they already happened, and as he would say, because of patterns they fell into, to be good at. And his point of education is the exact opposite. The exact opposite.
So, for example, one of the characteristics of education, if it's to serve this purpose of cultivating prophetic powers in the wider body of humanity, should be that it should be dialectical. Nothing should be taught just once. Everything should be taught at least twice from opposing points of view. And there'll be time for that if we abandon the encyclopedic idea and we say content should be selective deepening. It's thematic and project-oriented, not some coverage. And then the teaching should be dialectical.
Yes. And this is absolutely doable.
So that yes. Basic education can be more profound than university education.
Oh, definitely, yes.
One of the themes of the university system is the confusion of method, the forced marriage of method with subject matter. For example, economics is not the study of the economy. Economics is the study of a method invented at the end of the 19th century, the marginalist method. The study of economics by any other method, like by Max Weber, is not economics. That's one of the ways in which the university system conspires against the imagination.
Yes.
Another way is it confuses the facts, the empirical discoveries of natural science with the implicit ontologies or philosophical programs. So there's a confusion of metaphysics with empiricism in natural science. And so that too has to be explained. So the result is the national curriculums that exist in the world are attempts to infantilize the orthodoxies of the university culture and then impose them on the young, with the result that the young are delivered to the higher stages of education, emasculated and prepared for a life of intellectual servility. What we would want would be a form of basic education that would immunize them against these orthodoxies way before they reach the university. Then they're more able to ascend to prophetic powers.
Yes.
And that's another example of this worldly program. Now, many of you may not find it this worldly enough, but at least it's an attempt.
But it is a perfect example where we have created a perfect Emersonian world where the geniuses, as Emerson would call them, would be the few people who actually allow their imagination to run and they can do extraordinary things. And we've created an educational system that not only supports but actually socializes people into, to use Emerson's term, not being geniuses, to not firing their imagination. And we have an entire educational system bizarrely devoted, albeit not by intent, precisely for that purpose. Yeah. Let's open this up for more questions. Yes, please.
I want to ask you about the idea of genius, because
Yes.
genius anthropomorphized is a very new thing. The Greeks would not have thought genius as instilled in one person.
Yes.
It's just a moment like that. And when we are talking about that, Emersonian genius as a concept is individualized, but all its illustrations are in relations with nature, relations with history, relations with seeing the stars. So how do these two contradictions sort of emerge in Emerson's work? And the second one is, again, Nietzschean Übermensch is somebody separate from the world, which is weird because Jesus would have been an Übermensch, one with the world, as the historical Jesus, a figure, not Christianity. And Nietzsche himself would make a separation between these two, even though in his conduct he would not be a being related to other beings, but somehow individualized. So if you could tell more about these few points.
Yes. So and I'll answer by sort of meandering through the question, just to, in case everyone couldn't hear it. So well, begin more with the question, but then gets my meandering. So the question was, well, doesn't the notion of a genius or an Übermensch involve a completely dualistic framework where, by definition, they are not fully of this world, and then the tension is what happens when they have to be physically in this world? And I agree completely. So both Emerson and Nietzsche are, again, building on a secularized version of that form of Christianity coming out of, in terms of one side of it, Greek notions of being, in which the world is fundamentally one of structure, and then divinity is the miracle. It is the break. It is what is radically outside the structure. What breaks the structure is beyond the structure. It is infinite, and the power of the infinite we have been discussing. The danger of the structure, however, is intense, because once you have that notion of structure, then the infinite, exactly as you said, can be nothing other than the radically other that breaks, which, in the secularized version, means, as Roberto has said, the political crisis in which structures can be radically rethought, but then they just reform. And so it's always the miraculous moment, the single break. But the norm in this world is constant, non-changing structure. So exactly as you were getting at, if we were to rethink this notion of structure, and again, there's no philosophical reason we should accept the Greek notion of being, we largely have, but that is hardly the only way of thinking about the world. Other philosophical traditions have thought in dramatically different ways. If we do not buy into that, then indeed, does infinity always have to be thought of as simply the miraculous break from the otherwise normal, unchanging structure? And I would say there is no reason to pre-commit us to that dualism in which structure is defined that way. Yes, yes, and yeah, the immediate follow-up, please, yes.
Could I just challenge that notion of Nietzschean Übermensch being distinct? Because in his in the second essay of Genealogy, he writes of the Übermensch, he is the redeeming man of great love and contempt, the creative spirit whose compelling strength will not let him rest in any aloofness or any beyond.
Yes.
And so I'm not sure if I would track that as being present in Nietzschean notion of greatness in a human being.
Yeah, no, I think, and feel free to challenge me again when I say this, I think what Nietzsche is saying there is he does not want a Schopenhauerian vision. So Nietzsche loved Schopenhauer, but hated the ultimate implications of Schopenhauer, and saw a lot of his work as wrestling with Schopenhauer. And I think what he's saying there is, I do not want you to be a Schopenhauerian figure who would see yourself as simply removed from this world. The Übermensch is changing this world. But going back to the previous question, I think the Nietzschean vision of that is he is changing the world as an Übermensch, right? He is one of the very few who can do the transvaluation of values, rethink the world, create a new world within which everyone else, the masses, the herd, will simply be followers. So I think he is absolutely saying an Übermensch does not reject the world, an Übermensch changes the world, but in an Übermenschian way. In other words, only the elite few can do it. Yeah, please follow up.
If I could just follow up with that. I'm wondering, and this might be a a faulty thing to bring in, but I've always been so struck by Nietzsche's kind of last act, insanity, and falling on the horse that was being whipped on the streets. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to that to all of us and how you think. I mean, that for me, that is this great moment of declaration of love and compassion. And so, if you can speak to that a little bit.
I agree. And first, let me tell the anecdote in case you don't know it, and then let's talk about it, because I agree. It's an incredibly poignant moment that is perhaps very telling of the tensions in this philosophy. So the story refers to the fact that one of Nietzsche's final acts before falling into what was described by his contemporaries as really full insanity was he saw a horse being beaten just savagely, and he threw himself on the horse to save the horse and was just crying for the horse, and then had a complete breakdown of some kind, was thereafter hospitalized, was never really able to function well again. That it was also the period I should mention where his sister then started taking his writings and editing his unfinished volumes, which I might add led to that unbelievable volume called The Triumph of the Will, which is the main source that Hitler was taking from, and that was the form edited by his sister during Nietzsche's insanity, so it's not the work that Nietzsche himself wrote. And I mentioned that to get back to the anecdote. So if that extreme vision of the triumph of the will, that's certainly there in Nietzsche's writings, but it really is put together after he is no longer actively writing, and it's by his sister. What do we do then about, exactly as you said, this moment when in one of his, as far as we know, final acts, consciously, he is trying to save the horse, exactly as the question mentioned, a moment of incredible empathy, incredible love. And I don't have an answer, so I'll throw out one, and I would love both you but all others to throw out their possible reading. Oh, or feel free to jump in immediately, yes.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep. Your microphone works well.
So I've been thinking about where love factors in, and it ties into this discussion, where love factors in both Emerson and Nietzsche, based on just the readings that we were assigned for today. And it seems to me, in both cases, to be a sort of more like a respect, where you recognize somebody's nobility, you recognize that person really has something. And they might disagree with me, they might be on completely opposite sides, but I'm gonna tip my hat to that person. There's a nobility there. There's not a lot of room for vulnerability there. There's even kind of a deference. And so perhaps in the case of the horse, that's a case for Nietzsche, where he's seeing nobility being subjugated, but not by nobility, but rather by, I can imagine the conflict between the resentful masses and the nobles that are nevertheless brought down by the resentful masses, but not in a way that Nietzsche would say, warrants some sort of respect. So I can see an act like that without necessarily it coming from, we must protect the weak or the meek or the.
I love that answer, and let me throw out one that kind of it's less eloquent than yours, but gets at something similar. And so we'll have two on the table, and we'll take more and discuss them. One possible way of reading this, and this is totally guesswork, but it's an educated guesswork because a lot of autobiographies, a lot of biographies, not autobiographies, a lot of biographies have been written of him that have detailed a lot of his daily life. And I suspect this would be true of Emerson if we could find out more about him. Nietzsche was not in his daily life much of an Übermensch. Now, he was in his writings, both in the sense of being obviously brilliant, but also in that what you read when you read Nietzsche, this just incredible, just like love of saying the most transgressive things you could conceivably imagine, almost geared to anger one as much as one possibly could, written in this incredibly overwritten style, but powerfully overwritten. It's incredibly gripping. As a human, he was this incredible incredibly sickly person, had a lot of difficulty even functioning. He did try to have a relationship that was rebuffed, and evidently that just tore him to shreds, that he couldn't be in an actual relationship with the person that he felt he loved. He was this very vulnerable human being, and I can't help but think at the moment of that horse, as you said, it's not necessarily in contradiction to his thinking, and yet maybe too it's arising out of a side of him that he would never allow to show in his writings, which is he was this vulnerable person, did care about the poor horse being horribly beaten, with lots of evidence from his daily life where he was very saddened by poverty around him, hardly a vision of, there's the herd. So part of what's intriguing about him is you almost wish, going back to our bigger theme for the class, that if he had begun to rethink some of these ideas, perhaps he wouldn't have seen such a contradiction between his daily mundane life, where he was maybe a lot more empathetic and a lot more vulnerable, and didn't feel the need to build this armor of the great Übermensch, battling the world, because in his daily life, that doesn't seem to have really been all that there was to him. Yeah, please follow up, please, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because as I was reading, I'm aware of Nietzsche's, biography of sickliness and a lot of health issues and just frustrations in life. And I wonder if he could only have written this philosophy from the point of view of maybe giving voice to a part of him that maybe he didn't like so much, or maybe living vicariously through some potential Übermensch that he can imagine he can follow, perhaps. But then to go back to Emerson and what I understand of his biography, he did seem to embody much more vitality, much more success.
Much less of a contradiction, yeah.
Yeah, until he started losing his memory, until he started developing some dementia. And there's, anecdotes from his friends who talk about how painful it was to see him embarrassed by it. Yeah. So he didn't want to go out anymore in public.
Precisely.
And yet, I in those comments from friends, I could see the love for him in his vulnerability, but maybe as we're talking, there's needs to be more room for that vulnerability in love.
Yes,
maybe didn't have a chance to come into play in his own life.
Yes, yeah, please.
I think that the question of the motivation is less important than the question of the function that he performs in contemporary culture. He and ideas like him. So in the United States, a major philosophical current is what you could call vulgar Nietzscheanism, which is this cult of the will.
Yes.
And this is a theme in worldwide popular culture. So what is the functional basis of this theme? It's that the most powerful ideal now in the world, in world popular culture, is empowerment, the enhancement of agency. So individuals are subject to a daily experience of subjection, of oppression, of routinization, and there's a fantasy life of escape from that through empowerment, through the Übermensch. That's the basic structure of a lot of popular culture, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And to bring it to now, I think it's interesting that there's so much discourse around extraordinary people who say, we look at the greatness of a Picasso and kind of discount how abusive he was to women in his life. We look at the greatness of a Steve Jobs changed the world, but he was a terrible person to work with. And so I've been talking a lot, so I just want to make one kind of funny little anecdote to kind of speak to this ethic of greatness and respect without the vulnerability piece. There's a YouTuber, world champion strength athlete, who does these pranks where he dresses up as a janitor and he goes up to really burly people and he pretends like he doesn't know anything about lifting, but then he outlifts these people. He says, "Oh, let me try that. I don't know what I'm doing," and then he will lift something really heavy with one arm that they're struggling with two. And in those moments, the reason I bring that up is in those moments, the previously very ego-heavy, big-bodied lifters, they suddenly, there's this reverence. There's this like, oh, I should be the one cleaning up here rather than you. There's this, so there's a love, but more in the respect form, not so much in the, I'm going to take care of you, but I'm going to just tip my hat to you. Does that make sense in relation to like what we...
Yes. Gustavo, you
Very,
asked.
yes, please. Please, although if you could push the microphone in front of you, please. Yes, thank you, thank you.
Sorry, the provocation is about Nietzsche,
Yes,
because I'm studying him
yes.
nowadays, and we see scholars defending each of his associations to Nazis in basis of three arguments. One, the evil sister. The evil sister took her work and put it together in a way that is terrible, and falsified his writings. What it's not true. She didn't falsify anything.
Right, yeah. No, he wrote
She
all that.
just edited it
Yeah.
because the last work of him was
Absolutely.
diffused and a lot of notes and so on. The second argument is that he is against nationalism. He's not a nationalist. He's not a nationalist.
Yes.
He has had a despise for German nationalists. I am not able to pronounce this. And it's maybe not true either, because he despised the nationalism of his time, the Prussian nationalist Christian conservative of his time, the structural state, German state of his time. The third argument is that he is not a biological anti-Semite, and he was not a biological anti-Semite. But he is extremely anti-Semite, philosophically, ideologically. So Nietzsche was the official philosopher of the Nazi state and the Nazi party. The Nazi party construct like people like Rosenberg, his theory around it was the preferred philosopher of Hitler. So that declares that passion and love was the worst of all feelings in the universe and in this earth. The question I made, and his love for war, his final moments, well, Hitler loved her daughter.
Right. Oh, he was. Yes, a vegetarian.